Hello, everybody. We're just about ready to begin with this webinar on taking the helm, how to achieve your 25, 50, or 100-ton master captain's license. I'm Captain Bob Figueroa. I'm the founder and president of Mariners Learning System, a school that's approved by the Coast Guard to get your captain's license. We've been doing this stuff since 2002, and in that time, we've trained more than 200,000 students. I'm joined today with Samantha Calora. Sammy's our VP of Operations, and she will be taking care of stuff in the background, answering any online questions that we have. Tonight, what you can expect is a breakdown. We're going to go over the license in general, talk a little bit about what a 25, 50, or 100-ton master's license is. We're going to discuss the different types of license that can be issued. We'll talk about the requirements. There are some opportunities to level the license up, so we will also discuss those as well. And then we will end with some career opportunities, how you can put the license to work. As we're going through this, we're going to answer any questions that might come up, whether it's pertinent to this particular webinar or something with regards to the license. You can ask away, and we're always going to be happy to answer those types of questions. Before we begin, there's just a little bit of house cleaning that we need to take care of. To make sure that everybody's on board with us. So the first thing there is make sure your audio is on. In the bottom, you'll see that there is an audio icon. You should be able to hear me. And next, you'll also see that there's an icon for questions and answers. This will allow you to type questions in the right of your screen. As we're going through this, Sammy is going to answer the questions that she can. But at the end of each one of these sections, we're going to pause. I'll ask any questions so that we can make sure that if there's anything that is outstanding or that I didn't cover, we get it taken care of for you. So we're going to begin. One of the things that we like doing before we start these seminars so that we know how to organize the information and present the information is we poll you when you're signing up for the webinar. In this particular case, 59% of the people in this webinar were looking to explore personal and professional opportunities and maybe even start a side business. 18% or so want to be safer, more confident boater. There was 15% of you would like to turn your love for boating into a career. And then there was a smaller amount, 8% wanted to perhaps lower the cost of boat ownership, which may include reducing the cost of insurance in their premium. So who needs this license? Who needs a master's level license? In our world, the master's license is the highest level license which can be obtained, and it allows you to perform the duties of an OUPV six-pack captain and also operate inspected passenger vessels. So although this seminar is on the master's level license, we're going to take a moment and talk about the six-pack or the OUPV. The six-pack is perhaps the most prevalent license that is out there. The OUPV stands for Operator of Uninspected Passenger Vessels. They also call it a six-pack license because you can take 6 paying passengers plus 1 crew member out on the boat for compensation or for a fee. The master's level license itself does not limit the number of people you can take out. And it allows you to operate what they call inspected passenger vessels. Now, an inspected passenger vessel is a boat that has something that's called a COI, a Certificate of Inspection. This Certificate of Inspection isn't like the Coast Guard Auxiliary coming out and inspecting your boat at the beginning of the year to make sure that you have the safety equipment on board. This is a thorough inspection that is run by the Coast Guard. There's naval architects who are involved. They'll make sure that your bulkheads are built to the proper height. They'll make sure that the length and the weight is correct for the proportions of the boat. They would determine how many people you can take out on this vessel. They will determine the routes in which you can take this vessel on. For instance, some inspected passenger vessels are only approved to be operated professionally on inland waters. Others may be professionally approved to operate in inland waters and also near coastal waters, which would be in the ocean. It will dictate the COI, the Certificate of Inspection will dictate what type of emergency equipment that you have on board, how many crew members you must have on board. So it's an extensive documentation of that boat to make sure that because you are taking more than 6 paying passengers out on the vessel, that you're operating safely. So again, the 6-pack, the license itself limits you to no more than 6 paying passengers plus 1 crew member. The master's license does not, the license itself does not limit the number of people you can take out. That limitation is based on the vessel you are operating professionally and the COI, the certificate of inspection that comes with that particular boat. So let's talk about the definition. What is a 25, 50, or 100-ton master's? It allows the holder to operate inspected vessels as well as uninspected vessels. So that's what I was just saying in a moment ago, is that the OUPV is uninspected passenger vessels. They do not have COIs or certificate of inspections. If you have a master's level license, it being the highest level license, you can operate both inspected and uninspected passenger vessels underneath that same documentation. Any vessel that is authorized to carry more than 6 paying passengers must have on board a captain who holds a master's level license. Some examples of masters or vessels that would require a master level license would be a ferry boat, harbor tour boats, whale watching, and water taxis. These are all examples of inspected passenger vessels. So when we went through the definition, we brought up a couple of terms that I think are important to define. So one of the most important terms to identify is what is payment, or what the Coast Guard would call consideration. In the Coast Guard terms, consideration is any economic benefit or compensation given for a boating service. This includes money, goods, services, or anything of value. This is the key factor in determining if a boat activity is for hire, and if it is, that would require a licensed captain. So again, we call it payment, but the Coast Guard considers it, it calls it consideration, and consideration is money, goods, services, or anything of value. We're going to break this down just a little bit more just to make sure that we're clear on this. So what counts as consideration? A direct payment for a boat trip. So if you are in a port that is offering boat trips, you may pay for a ticket or for your family to go on board that boat. You may pay a charter fee. These are direct forms of payment, and it's pretty clear that if you're making a direct payment for any sort of a boat trip, that you would need to have a licensed captain on board that vessel. So here's a couple areas where it's a little less clear. So let's talk about bartering service or gifts in exchange for a ride. So let's say that I own a villa on a golf course and you own a boat, and we run into each other at a function. And during our conversation, I say, hey, if you would like to bring your family to my villa on the golf course for a weekend, in exchange for you taking me and my family out on your boat for the weekend, that would be something that the Coast Guard would consider as a payment or consideration for that ride. So again, if you're bartering services or you're exchanging gifts, then that is what the Coast Guard would call considerations. If your guests are covering most of or all of the trip's expenses, that is also consideration. So if a couple buddies or 2 families, if I own a boat and I've got another family and they said, oh, we'd like to come out on the boat with you, and I invite them, and they said, well, we'd like to share in the costs. And they give me a little bit of money for the fuel, or they choose to pay for dinner or something like that. That is not something that the Coast Guard would be concerned with or call consideration. However, let's say that I'm running a boat down to Florida and they say, well, we'll pay for the fuel and all the dockage fees. That is something for that trip would be something that the Coast Guard would consider for payment because they were paying most or all of the trip's expenses. And then finally, if a company paid or sponsored outing. So if a company pays me to take out their organization on my boat, then that is consideration. That is a form of payment. And the same thing with sponsored outings. Now, I tell a story often when I used to own a sailing school, and we used to teach youngsters and all ages to get their license. There was a church in the area that was teaching during a summer camp, and they didn't have licensed captains, and the kids were getting on the boats with adults who were teaching them how to sail. In and of itself, it sounded fairly innocent. However, because you had to be a member of the church and you had to pay for the summer camp, that was a form of consideration in the Coast Guard's eyes. I talked to the person who was in charge of this operation, and I explained to him, I said, you really need to have licensed captains running these boats, because these adults are on board the boats and they're giving direct instruction. He said, no, I'm not taking any money for this. The adults who are helping us aren't taking any money for this. I said, well, can somebody from the street just show up and take one of these lessons? And they said, no, they have to be a member of the camp. They have to be a member of the church. Again, I explained to this person that this was consideration in the Coast Guard's eyes. His reply to me was, well, you're in the business and all you're trying to do is sell me some courses. I had no intent of selling him courses, and that wasn't what I was doing. And because it was a church and it was a local organization, the truth of the matter is, if he had wanted to put somebody through my training, I probably wouldn't have charged him anyways. However, they went on doing what they were doing, and the next season they weren't doing any of this training. And they had all their boats up on they had 4 or 5 sailboats, and they were all just sitting out of the water. I ran into the person who ran this operation again, and I asked him, I said, so what's going on? He said, well, I wish I had taken your advice. I said, what do you mean? He said, one of the kids had fallen off the boat, didn't get hurt. When you're teaching small sailboats, part of the fun is getting wet and falling in the water. Somebody fell in the water, and it freaked the parent out, and the parent sued the church. And it cost the church a couple $100,000 because they did not have licensed captains on their vessel. So you want to make sure that you are not skirting the rules and that you really do understand what consideration is, because the Coast Guard is very, very specific with what their expectations are based on a fee. So here's a couple of situations that don't require a license. As I said, if you're truly sharing expenses, you're evenly splitting the fuel, food, dockage fees, things like that. If it's truly, these are my friends, we're going out on my boat, and we've decided that we're going to split the expenses of this particular trip or this weekend or whatever, that is fine. If friends or family are going on a personal trip, so let's say that I still run charter boats, and let's say that, and I am a licensed master, but I bring friends or family out on my boat, then that is a personal trip and it does not count as consideration. And also with regards to that, because it is not a commercial trip, I am not bound by the requirements of my license to have 6 or less people on my boat or a certificate of inspection. Again, it can be a commercial vessel or it can be a personal vessel used for commercial operations. But if I'm taking friends or family out, I am not obligated by the requirements of the license that I carry. If no money or benefit is provided to the boat operator, then there's no consideration. I can take a complete stranger out. I can run into a couple at dinner and say, hey, would you guys like to go out on the boat? And I don't have to know them. But there is no money or benefit provided. It's not a business associate. It's not somebody who I want to donate money to an organization that I might run. As long as there's no benefit provided and there is no money that passes hands, then again, this is not something the Coast Guard would consider a pay trip. The trip must be completely voluntary, and as I said, it must be equally shared. So that's what is and is not consideration. It's really important that you understand this information because of some of the legal risks. If consideration is present, a licensed captain is legally required. Operating for hire without a license can lead to heavy fines, vessel seizure. You can be penalized criminally. So you want to make sure that you protect yourself and your passengers and know what the rules are. With the heavy fines, the Coast Guard can charge you $5,000 per occurrence if you're running charters or you're running trips without a valid license. So let's say that I'm a teacher and I've taken off the summer and I have my license and I am now running charters, or I do not have my license and I'm running charters on the side and I get caught. The Coast Guard's not only going to be looking at the day that they caught me, but they're going to be looking at my logbooks and my social media posts and other methodology to determine how many days I was out on the water. And based on those total number of days is what the fine is going to be based on. That's what got the church in trouble with my earlier example. It wasn't the one day that they were out on the water, but they ran 2 months worth of operations and it was $5,000 per day that they were out on the water. So consideration is really important when you are making decisions as to whether you should or should not charge a fee, whether you do or do not have a license, and whether you do or do not have the proper license for the charters that you're running. When I talked about the 6-pack, I told you you could take 6 paying passengers plus 1 crew member. On the master's level license, the COI or the certificate of inspection is going to dictate how the minimum number of crew members you have to bring out on the boat with you. So we need to understand what a crew member is. A crew member is any person engaged in any capacity aboard the vessel, except for the master, that would be the captain, and the passengers. So if I come on board that boat and I am handling lines, or if I'm helping them dock, or if I'm giving instructions to the passengers, or if I am handing out drinks, or any other activity that is supporting that charter, then I am considered a crew member. So they perform the duties that support the operation or the safety of the vessel. Now, a lot of people think that, well, I'm not paid, so how can I be considered a crew member? In the Coast Guard world, it does not matter whether you're paid. What's most important is your role within that operation. Now, lots of people get themselves jammed up with, let's say that the COI says I have to have 3 crew members on, and one of my crew members doesn't show up, but I still want to run that charter. And I've got 20 people on the boat, and I'm doing a special party, and I talk to the owner of, or whoever contracted me to do this, and say, look, I'm short a crew member. I can't leave the dock without him. Does one of your buddies or one of the people who are on this trip want to be a member of my crew? And they say yes. Well, it seems as if you're shortcutting the rules of the Coast Guard. However, if you were to get pulled over, or there was some sort of an issue and the Coast Guard wanted to know who your crew members were, a crew member does not, or is not required by the Coast Guard to have additional training. There's not a course, or there's not a certificate for a crew member. However, to be an active crew member, you need to be in a drug testing program. If you're not in a Coast Guard approved or recognized drug testing program, well, then you cannot be a crew member. So it's not regular course of business that you're picking out a stranger on board your boat and they meet the requirements of the Coast Guard because of the drug test. So again, the Coast Guard is very, very specific. The fines are very steep. Interestingly enough, most people will say, well, I'll never get caught. I'm not going to do anything wrong. I'm not going to draw any attention to myself. So I'm not going to do anything. I don't have to worry about this. The way my experience has been that when there's an accident, somebody falls overboard, or 2 boats touch, those are obviously issues where the Coast Guard is going to look at your documentation. But in my experience over the years, the number one way that somebody gets caught running these charters illegally is that there is a charter boat captain or a group of charter boat captains who are running their operations out of that marina or that waterway, and they know that there is somebody who's running illegally. They're the ones who will generally pick up the phone and call the Coast Guard, and that's how most people get caught from what my experience is. So we went over what consideration was. We understand now what a crew member is. We need to know what the differences between everybody is. A passenger, they just pay for the trip. They receive new duties or responsibilities. They're just along for the ride. You got a crew member, they assist in the vessel operation. They do not pay for the trip. Crew members do not count towards the six limit of a six-pack license, and the correct classification is key for compliance and insurance. So not only do you have the Coast Guard compliance, but you also have the insurance. If the Coast Guard jams you up for running illegal charters, or you do not have the proper level license, or you do not have the proper number of crew members on board your boat, then your insurance company is going to for sure cancel your insurance, and it will be nearly impossible to be reinsured, which will basically take you out of business. So these are just the just general terminology, understanding what the differences are. There's not a lot of people who talk about this, but it's a really important element of getting your license. So the compliance and responsibility, mislabeling a crew member as a passenger or vice versa can result in the fines or violations that we talked about. As the captain, you're responsible for this. You're responsible for knowing who the crew is and who the passengers are. You're required to make sure that everyone's got the proper training and safety practices for the crew. So on a 25, 50, or 100-ton master's license, the COI, the Certificate of Inspection, may require additional training for those crew members. You need to follow that and making sure that they are trained properly. Now, it might not be in the operation of the vessel itself, but the COI might require that you do a man overboard drill and record this once a month. You may need to do a recovery from water drill once a month. You may need to have man your lifeboats drills. You may have to have firefighting drills. Depending on the type of vessel and the operation that you're having in the inspected passenger vessel, there are additional requirements that the COI will dictate to the owner of that particular boat. Something I just said a moment ago is you want to make sure that you document those roles clearly, so that if you do get an inspection or something goes wrong, that you have legal documentation to support your claims. On my boats, I always have a logbook, regardless, even if I have friends or family going out on the boat. I always run an active logbook. I list who is on the boat. If it is a professional operation, I list who is on the boat as a crew member, who is on the boat to assist me, who are the members of who are the passengers. And then if anything happens, if a passenger slips, I record it. If everything went well, I record that as well. So I'm always very careful with the documentation that I use. In the event that something were to go wrong or go right, I want to make sure that I have this stuff clearly documented, and I use a logbook, and that's what most professional captains would use. Do we have any questions, Sammy?
What if somebody's doing a boat delivery and their owner is not on board?
Okay, so the question is, what if I'm doing a boat delivery and the owner is not on board the boat? Am I required to have a license? The answer is, so from the Coast Guard's perspective, the answer would be no. You would not be required to have a license if you're doing a boat delivery without an owner on board. But I will tell you, again, from experience, because I've done a lot of deliveries, the Coast Guard may not require you to have a license, but the insurance companies most likely will. So if you're doing boat deliveries, which is a great way of, and we'll talk a little bit about them again a little later on, boat deliveries is a great way of earning some money with your license, but the insurance companies may dictate that you have a license, and they can also dictate whether it's a 6-pack or a master's. So I used to do a lot of international deliveries. And I do both power and sail. A lot of people know me as a sailor because I sailed around the world, but I consider myself equally versed. It doesn't matter to me whether it's a power boat or a sailboat. My first job with my license occurred within 1 week of me getting my license, and it was on a sailboat to move a boat from Miami to Annapolis for Thanksgiving, and then bring it right back down to Miami and then go across into the Caribbean. The interesting thing with that delivery is that the Coast Guard didn't require me to have the license, but the insurance company would not have insured me if I did not have a master's level license. That's something I skipped over in the beginning. We always tell people, everyone's like, well, should I get a 6-pack or can't get a master's? We always tell people, go for the highest level license that you qualify for. Myself, I was retired. I was fortunate. I sold a company when I was 38. I got my license for very personal reasons. I never thought I'd use the license professionally. As I said, a week after I got my license, I had my first job. My first year, I made 110 grand doing boat deliveries. Now, I was in a bar. I ran into a guy. He gave me the same advice I just gave you. He said, get the highest level license you can obtain. I said, I'm not going to ever use it. He said, Bob, you'll be disappointed if you don't. So I got my master's level license. When I got that first job, if I had just had my 6-pack, because we were going into the Bahamas with that trip, the Coast or the insurance company would never insured me to be moving that boat. 23, 24, almost 25 years later, I've generated a bunch of revenue with my school, with other businesses that I've owned, with charters and instruction, and all of that was possible because I had a master's level license. If there's two people sitting at the dock, one person has a 6-pack and the other person has a master's level license, on my shirt it says USCG licensed master. Being able to say that in business carries weight. There's nothing wrong with the 6-pack. So any of those people who have 6-packs or are considering getting a 6-pack or can't qualify for a master's level license, again, there's nothing wrong with a master's level license. However, I would strongly recommend that you go for the highest level license that you can obtain. Anything else, Tammy?
No.
We must be moving along swiftly tonight. So let's see what else we've got. So we're going to talk about the master's license, and there's 3 different versions of a master's license. There's a 25, 50, or 100-ton license. This is based on the weight of the vessel itself. When we were talking about the 6-pack, the 6-pack is good for is good for 6 paying passengers plus one crew member, and it is good for vessels up to 100 gross tons. Because it is limited by the number of people you can take out, the Coast Guard considers that a limit of risk. With the masters, you're no longer limiting the number of people who you can take out. You're limiting the size vessel that you qualify for. So a 25-ton boat is a boat. And again, this really depends on how the boat is built, the materials. There's a lot of variables that go into this, but I'm just going to send out some general statements that are not going to be right in every case. It's just an example. A 25-ton boat could be a boat 35, 40, 45 feet. A 50-ton vessel is 30 to maybe 65 feet, and a 100-ton vessel is 60, 65 feet or greater. Again, that is just a generalization, but that gives you a good idea of the size of boats that this would qualify for. So again, it comes in 3 versions. It's a 25, a 50, or 100-ton license. With us, with Mariner's Learning System and the way our school is approved by the Coast Guard, it is the same course and it is the same program. There is no difference in the training between a captain who's going to get a 25, a 50, or a 100-ton license. What will make a difference as to which license will be issued is the amount of your sea service time and the size vessel that you have been on. this will have an impact on it. So the Coast Guard wants to make sure that the license that you're issued is similar to what that of your boating experience would be. So if my experience was on a 15-foot or a 20-foot center console, that in today's world with the current Coast Guard rules and regulations, that experience on that boat, and we're going to go into the specific days and things like this. I'm going to clean this up a little bit in a moment. However, if the largest size boat that I've got experience on was a 19-foot center console, and you can meet the requirements of a master's level license, the Coast Guard is going to issue a 25-ton master's license. So you don't actually have to have experience on a 25 or a 50 or 100-ton license to get that level license. They have different variables that they will apply to your experience, and they will give you the highest level license that you can qualify for based on your boating experience. With the master's license, you're not required to advance through the different licenses one at a time. If you meet the Coast Guard requirements for 100-ton masters, then that's what license you will get right out of the gate. So you do not need to go from a 6-pack to a 25-ton masters, and then once you have your 25-ton masters, advance to a 50-ton, and then advance from a 50 to 100. If you have no license at all, and you meet the requirements for a 100-ton masters, that's the license that you will get out of the gate. The master's license, so we've got the 25, we've got the 50, and we have the 100-ton license. They are issued for operations in the Great Lakes, inland, near coastal waterways. So when we're talking about near coastal waterways, as a general statement, you're outside what they call the boundary lines. Now, for the East and West Coast, again, this is a general statement. The boundary line is basically crossed once you go outside the inlet. This isn't true in all cases, but for this statement, it's close enough for these purposes. So with a master's level license, if you get what they call a near coastal masters, that's good for 200 miles offshore. The inland master's license is good for inland waterways, lakes, rivers, bays, sounds, those types of waters. And then you have the Great Lakes, which is specific to the Great Lakes. Now, the interesting thing about the Great Lakes is that the Coast Guard considers one day on the Great Lakes to be equal to a day in the ocean. So if most of your experience is on the Great Lakes and you can meet the minimum requirements for days, which we'll go over in a moment, then they will issue you a Great Lakes license and also include what they call a near coastal endorsement. So that would mean that you're allowed to operate on both the Great Lakes and out in the ocean up to 200 miles offshore. Now, the license is also not issued by a geographic area. So if my experience is in Texas and I move to Southern Florida, that license is still valid any place in the United States. So it's not something that is dictated by a geographic boundary. The only limitations on that, again, is based on where my boating experience is. Now, some of our clients, so if you've got experience in Long Island Sound or the Chesapeake Bay, both of those waterways, although they are rough and tough and they have a lot of commercial traffic that goes through those, because of the boundary lines and the way that is set up with the Coast Guard, those are considered to be inland waterways. So, and we run into people all the time, well, I want a near coastal license. Well, if you're always operating on inland waters, who cares? Who cares which license? And the great thing about these licenses, if you do begin with an inland license and you gather enough time for a near coastal license, you can upgrade the license later on down the road. So you're not locked into a inland license. If you do get a near coastal license, that qualifies you for inland waterways as well. So you've got the Great Lakes, you've got an inland and near coastal waterways. For the master's level license, a near coastal license is good for 200 miles offshore. So let's talk a little bit, I need a little drink. Let's talk a little bit about some of the requirements for the master's level license. And in many ways, the requirements for a master's level license are very, very similar for that of a six-pack. There's just one or two slight differences. So for a master's level license, you need to be a minimum of 19 years old. You can be 18 years old and take the course, and on your 19th birthday, apply for the license. But for the master's level license, you need to be 19 years old. The six-pack requires you to be 18 years old. So this is one of those differences. For the six-pack, you need to be 18. For a master's level license, you need to be 19. The way that our approval is with the Coast Guard, once you begin our program, you have a year to complete it. Once you complete the course, you have an additional year to meet the requirements of the Coast Guard. So again, it's not unusual for a student of ours to start a program before they're old enough or before they have all the sea service that is required. So you can be 18 and work towards getting your master's level license, and on your 19th birthday, you can apply and still get your license. On the upper end, there is no maximum age limit. So if you want to be an airline pilot when you're 65 years old, you by law have to retire. The Coast Guard is not concerned about an upper age limit. There is a lower age limit of 19, but on the upper side, it's really based on your physical condition and your ability to pass a physical. And we'll talk about that in a moment. A secondary difference between the six-pack and the master's level license with regards to citizenship is with a six-pack, you do not need to be a U.S. citizen. If you are not a U.S. citizen, you are required to have a green card or a working visa. With a master's level license, you must be a U.S. citizen. There's no exceptions to that. If you're not a U.S. citizen, then you're not going to be able to qualify for a master's level license. So let's talk about the boating experience a little bit. So there's a form that we'll provide you. It's a Coast Guard form 719S. The number is really not important. It's called a small vessel sea service form. It's the way that we record the amount of time that you're out on the water. And it is the preferred document of the Coast Guard when it comes down to your application. Now, if you're working commercially, for a shipping business or for a ferry business, you do not necessarily need to fill out a sea service form, a small vessel sea service form. A letter from your operator that clearly identifies what your role was on the boat, the number of days that you were out on the water, and some other various information, then the Coast Guard will accept that. However, we try to stick with the norm and not the exceptions, because my experience is the Coast Guard's got two piles of paperwork. The paperwork the pile that you want to be in is the one that moves along smartly and easily. And the secondary pile is the one that is based on exceptions or things that the Coast Guard has to now investigate and make sure are actually true. So the small vessel sea service form is the best way of recording your boating experience. The way this form looks is it basically looks like a calendar. Within each calendar month, there's 5 slots. These slots represent years of your choice. So if I were filling out my sea service form now, June of 2005, I was boat 8 days. June 2006, I was boat 9 days. June 2007, I was boat 13 days. Do I know that to be factual? No, but I owned a boat during that period of time. Close enough for these purposes. So it basically falls down to a best guess. However, you want to be as accurate you possibly can. And whenever you're filling out your paperwork with the Coast Guard, always be truthful. The lies are misdirection, are misrepresentation of what the actual facts are, will always catch up to you. I've got so many examples, so many stories of people who did not listen to this advice, who either didn't get their license or their license issuance was delayed by a year or more because they weren't honest with what they said was the truth. So that's the small vessel sea service form. Within this small service sea vessel form, you need to, for a master's level license, you need to be able to demonstrate that you got a minimum of 360 days worth of boating experience since your 16th birthday. 90 of those days have to occur within the last 3 years. The Coast Guard considers this to be recency. So what they want to avoid is, let's say that when I was a youngster, I spent a lot of time on the water, and then I got busy with my family and business and things like this, and I hadn't been out on the water in 30 years. Well, I may have had that 360 days boating experience when I was younger, but I haven't been out on the water in 30 years. That is not the experience that they're looking for. So they want to make sure out of that total 360 days, 90 of those days have occurred within the last 3 years. Again, this is called recency. In the Coast Guard world, 4 hours out on the water counts as a day. So if I go out at 8 o'clock in the morning and I come back in at 8 o'clock at night, in the Coast Guard world, that's 1 day. Because 4 hours counts as a day, I could claim 1 day in a 24-hour period of time. Now, if I went out at 8 o'clock at night and came back in at 4 o'clock in the morning, that would count as 2 days because there was a day between the two occurrences. So just be aware, I need a minimum of 360 days worth of boating experience, 90 of which need to be within the last 3 years. 4 hours out on the water counts as a day. Now, again, for those of you who might work for a boat company or for a shipping company, if you are out on the water and you're doing 12-hour shifts, the Coast Guard may allow you to count that as a day and a half. But again, that is an exception to the rule, and either you can call us to discuss it or you can speak to the National Maritime Center directly before you fill out your paperwork. Again, we try to stick with the norms, not the exceptions. So as a general statement, the majority of our students, 4 hours out on the water counts as a day. The next thing I need to do is I've got to be able to pass a physical. The physical is in place just to confirm that you do meet the physical and medical standards that the Coast Guard has defined to ensure that you can perform your duty safely. It can be performed by a qualified physician, a physician's assistant, or a nurse practitioner. Part of this, though, as you're using the nurse practitioner or a physician assistant, is they've got to have the proper equipment for the vision and the hearing portion of this physical examination. As a general statement, it's a similar physical that a truck driver will take. Now, there are 10 pages in this form. Make sure that you read through it and identify anything that you might be concerned with. There are several disqualifiers, but what we've done is we've just broken down what we have found to be the 5 top medical conditions that may delay your captain's license. Now, none of these things by themselves are necessarily a disqualifier, but these for sure of 23 years of doing this are the top concerns and the top reasons why people have either had their paperwork delayed or were not able to pass the physical. There are other reasons, but these are the top 5. Cardiac disease. So let's say that I have a stent, or perhaps I had to have other surgery on my heart. That by itself is not a disqualifier, but what the Coast Guard is going to be looking for is at least 18 months of somebody not messing with my ticker, a letter from my cardiologist telling me that I have a clean bill of health and that my heart should not be a concern when the Coast Guard is considering me for getting my license. And if after that they're still concerned, there may require that you take a stress test. That's all dependent upon various things that are beyond my abilities of understanding. But just because you've had some sort of bypass surgery or perhaps a stent, that alone is not a reason for you not to get your license. but you will need to be able to demonstrate that in the last 18 months you've been healthy, you haven't had any adjustments, they haven't had to change a pacemaker, they haven't had to go in there and put another stent in or clean any valves or mess with you in any way, shape, or form. And then you're going to need a strongly written letter from your cardiac or from your physician. And again, with that information, if the Coast Guard's still concerned, they may require that you do a stress test. Second most popular disqualifier is diabetes, if you're a diabetic. So diabetes alone is not a disqualifier. What the Coast Guard's generally looking at is they're really concerned with your A1C. If your A1C is below 8, then it's not necessarily a disqualifier as long as your diabetes is controlled, managed by a doctor. You will need to get a certificate or some sort of a letter from your doctor saying that your diabetes are well controlled and it's not a concern. So if you're a diabetic, then the main concern that the Coast Guard has when they're looking at the medical piece of being a diabetic is your A1C. If it's below 8, then and it is controlled and it is managed by your doctor, then that would not be a disqualifier by itself. Psychiatric disorders. The fact that you've had some sort of psychiatric disorder in your background is not necessarily a disqualifier. But if it is, I'm going to use this word twice in a very short period of time, but if it is a chronic disorder, if it's something that you're in and out of hospitals for, if it's something that you're in and out of treatment for, then that's going to be a true concern of the Coast Guard and something that I would want to talk to them prior to trying to become a licensed captain, not after. So psychiatric disorders, the fact that you've had some sort of a problem is not an issue in of itself. It really, if it was an isolated situation and it's been dealt with, well, then again, that's not going to be a disqualifier. However, if you're in and out of hospitals and you're in and out of care and treatment is an ongoing piece to your health, then the Coast Guard is going to be concerned with this. Sleep apnea, another area that the Coast Guard's concerned with. If it is controlled, and again, you might have a CPAP machine or things like this, they may require that you do a sleep study, but they want to make sure sleep apnea is for sure a concern of the Coast Guard. And then finally, with this in this list, chronic use of narcotics. And the chronic use of narcotics can be both prescribed or perhaps illegal drugs. So if you have a record and you've been arrested multiple times and you've been found to have illegal narcotics on your possession, then the Coast Guard is going to be very concerned about this. However, they're equally concerned if you're using what they would consider narcotics for psychiatric disorders. So for instance, myself, I had real serious problems with my lower back. So I was taking various times, I was taking Percocet, I was taking fentanyl before fentanyl became the big rage, and everybody knows what it is now. That was a prescribed treatment for me. When I was underneath the care of the doctor, and I was taking those drugs to help me deal with the pain associated with the issue that I had, I could not have used my license professionally because I was using narcotics. Now, in my particular case, once the issue that was causing the pain was dealt with, I was no longer using those narcotics. I got away from the addiction associated with those narcotics, and it was not an issue because I was not chronically using those narcotics over a period of time. So cardiac disease, diabetic, psychiatric disorders, sleep apnea, are chronic use of narcotics. Those are the 5 top things that the Coast Guard is looking at. As I said, there are others, but these are the 5 main. The next piece to this, you need to be able to pass a drug test. This is a DOT-approved drug test. It's a 5-panel urine test. So you're not going to be giving blood, you're going to be peeing in a cup. I hear many students who call me and say this was the hardest test that they had to study for. So the thing that has gotten a little bit complex and complicated with this drug test is I happen to live in a state that you're allowed to legally, from in the state's eyes, smoke pot recreationally. And however, that is the state, not the federal government. The federal government still sees this as an illegal activity. So even if you live in a state that allows you to recreationally partake in smoking marijuana or eating edibles or any of the other things that you can do, you are still going to be in violation of the requirements of having a license and being able to pass a drug test. Just last week or 2 or 3 weeks ago, we got a call from one of our clients. I'm 65. It was a gentleman about the same age as mine, and he failed the drug test. And he called and said, I just had one gummy. Well, unfortunately, in his world, it was only one gummy, but in the Coast Guard's world, it was one gummy too many. So if you are going to be using your license and you do happen to live in a state that allows you to recreationally purchase marijuana or other drugs of your choice, the Coast Guard is still going to frown upon this. One of the requirements, not only are you going to have to pass a drug test, but if you plan on using your license professionally, you're going to have to be in a random drug testing program. And what this random drug testing program, it's a consortium. It'll cost $65 to $95 for a year or two. That's generally how they do it. And what happens is that your name gets put into a pool. And depending on how their approval is, once a month, they will pull a number of names out of this database. And if your name gets called, you've got basically 3 days to go pee in a cup. If you do not show up within those 3 days, and you're not out of state, you're not on a business trip, you're not out of the country, you don't have some sort of very good reason for not showing up for the drug test, and the Coast Guard can consider that a failure, and your license will be put on hold. If you are a police officer, a first responder, in the military, if you are in a random drug testing program because of your job, you would just need to get a letter from your employer stating that you are in a drug testing program and that you have not failed or refused to take a drug test in the last 180 days. When you're doing the drug test as well, the drug test is good for 6 months. So once you pee in the cup, you got 6 months to send in your application. So this takes a little bit of thinking through the process because, as I said earlier, if you choose to go through Mariner's Learning System, once you complete our course and pass our test, which we'll talk a little bit more in a moment, which you have a year to finish. Then once you finish it, you have an additional year to meet the requirements of the Coast Guard. So if I begin this program and I go do my drug test, regardless of the fact that you have a year to complete it with us and another year to meet those requirements, that drug test is only good for 6 months. So as a general recommendation, as a rule, I normally will tell our clients, our students, to do the CPR First Aid drug test and physical at the tail end of your course. That way you're not artificially starting a timer that you have to live by. Now, if you have a job or if you truly think that in a month or two you're going to be done and you're ready to move forward, which it's 100% possible to do, then sure, you can go ahead and do this. But just be aware that once you pee in that cup, you've got 6 months to make sure that everything is done. So just be aware. That way you're not wasting money. And then another piece that the Coast Guard is going to be concerned with this application is convictions. So with regards to the convictions, you're going to have to fill out this form if CG 719C. This is only if you have a conviction. If you do not, you don't have to worry about this form. So the number one rule with your convictions is be honest. The Coast Guard is going to do a background check, which I'm going to talk about. They're going to do a background check. Most likely when they ask this question, they already know what the answer is. They may not be as concerned with what the conviction was as whether you're honest and you're actually disclosing the fact that this has occurred. Now, when you're filling out this form, so As I said, I'm 65. Let's say that I was 18. I got caught smoking pot. And I went to court and I was convicted. And the judge says, look, if you don't do anything wrong for the next 6 months, we're going to expunge your records. So don't do anything stupid in 6 months. Now, fast forward to now. I'm looking to get my captain's license, and the Coast Guard has this form, said, have I ever been convicted? And I say no. The problem isn't that I was convicted of smoking dope when I was a boy. The problem is now that I'm not copping to the facts of the truth. The fact that it was expunged, it didn't ask me. They're not saying, do I have any convictions that were expunged? They ask, have any convictions occurred? So be honest, because if you don't, it's going to cost you. Now, an isolated situation when I was younger is not a reason to lose a license. But let's say that when I was 18, I got caught smoking dope. Let's say when I was 24, I got a DWI. When I was 48, I got another DWI. Now, at 65, the Coast Guard is going to be less than interested in giving me a captain's license because I have shown a pattern that is going to be concern of theirs. Now, let's say that when I was 48, I got busted for a DUI or whatever, and I had to go to some sort of court recovery, whether it was a class or whatever. And I went through that, and I got certified, and I haven't drank since. Now, that is something I would want to make sure that I included in my application to say that I was younger, I was foolish. But in the last 20 years, I haven't done anything like that. I followed what the court asked me to do. There's been no more pullovers. There's been no more convictions. There's been no more issues. Here's my documentation that supports that I took the treatment that the court required of me. In that case, I would expect that you would be given your license. All right. So again, the only time you're filling out this form is if you do have convictions. The codes are very, very specific with what a conviction is. And you want to make sure that if you meet those requirements that you record it, because not recording it, it's going to be a problem for you. Next, you need to have an adult CPR and basic first aid card we recommend the American Red Cross or the Heart Association. There are plenty of other organizations that the Coast Guard will approve or has approved. The reason we recommend the American Red Cross or Heart Association, and again, these are on the Coast Guard's checklist when they are looking at your application. Somebody from Joe's CPR and First Aid school, it might be valid, and it might be, but it's not a primary one. So now the Coast Guard is going to take your paperwork, move it to another pile, and now they have to go see whether this meets the requirements of the Coast Guard. So the American Red Cross, the Heart Association, they do great jobs. This is what we recommend. Now, you're going to have an adult CPR and basic first aid card. Especially with the CPR, sometimes they will have adult, child, and infant. That's fine if you go through and get the adult, child, and infant, but at very least, you need to make sure that you have the adult CPR and basic first aid. If there's additional things that are on your card, then that's fine, but you do need to have at very least the adult CPR and basic first aid on that card. Anything in addition to that is fine. Now, when we talk to doctors or we talk to first responders, so if I'm a medical doctor, obviously my credentials are superior to this card. However, the Coast Guard's not looking for your credentials as a doctor. They're looking for this adult CPR and basic first aid card. So if you're a first responder or you're a doctor or somebody who possesses credentials that are higher than this requirement, you're a surgeon, I would most strongly recommend that you go to the local community hospital or perhaps the one that you work in. And if it's with the American Red Cross, you can test out for like $20. It would be much easier for you to submit this card than it would be your credentials. And I hear from doctors all the time that say, well, Bob, I wish I listened to you, or my paperwork is on hold now. Is there something that you can do? Nothing that I can do. So again, even if you have superior credentials in this, the easiest path, the path of least resistance, would be go ahead and call the American Red Cross or Heart Association in your area and see whether you can just test out. Tell them what your credentials are and see whether you can just test out. And then you also need to get a background check. The background check is done through something that's called a Transportation Workers Identification Credential. It's called a TWIC card. This background check is done through Homeland Security. If you have a fast pass for an airport or there's 5 or 6 of them that are out there now that you can walk to the front of the line. You did that with the TSA. You will need to go to the same location that you did this, but it's a different card. So you can't use your credentials that gets you to the front of the line at an airport as your TWIC card. Again, this is going to be a background check. Homeland Security is going to do it. The credential that's issued is a biometric credential that has information that is specific to you embedded in a chip within this card. So it's through Homeland Security. And as I said earlier, especially when it comes down to your convictions, things like this, the Coast Guard is going to run this background, Homeland Security is going to run this background check. If there's any sort of issues, it is going to show up. So do yourself a favor when the Coast Guard asks if I had any sort of convictions. Again, because you're going to have a TWIC card, they already know. So just give them the information and be as accurate as you can. So if something had happened to me when I was 18, I probably wouldn't remember most of it by now. But what I want to do is I want to paint as clear of a picture as I possibly can so that the person who's looking at my application is looking at the results of this TWIC card, says, okay, this looks very close to what actually occurred. The dates might be a little wrong or this might, but you know what? The guy was honorable. He gave me the information. I can see that this and this, they correspond with each other. That's all you need to do. And then finally, you need to meet the written requirements of the Coast Guard. So you're going to have to pass what is called a proctored examination. With Mariner's Learning System, we teach in an online format. So you do it at your own pace, on your own schedule, on your own time frame. The thing that kind of sets us apart, and this is the only commercial part of this whole deal, the thing that we like to think sets us apart is we really teach understanding and not so much the memorization aspect to this. There's lots of schools out there that will teach you that B is the right answer, but when you're done with the course, you might not necessarily understand why B is the right answer. Not only do we want you to know the B is the right answer for a particular type of a question, but we want you to know why. Because when you're out on the water and a boat's steaming down on you, you know the B is the right answer, but you don't know why, that's a problem. To do this, we've trained over 200,000 students since we've begun this. Everybody learns a little bit differently. The only requirement to coming into one of our courses, and it's a Coast Guard requirement, is that you got to be able to speak English. So that's the only requirement. So unlike a college or a university or even a trade school, we don't get to pick and choose the students who come through our program. So we use a wide variety of learning tools to ensure that we can adapt to most people's learning needs. So within the online program, there are ebooks that are downloadable, they're printable. You can pull them up on a laptop. You can pull them up on an iPad or any other sort of special device. This allows you to have access to the program when you're on or offline. When necessary, we also use videos. We use animated videos. We do that for a few reasons, but the great thing about an animated video versus using stock photography or stock videos from online is we control what the video shows, and we can be very precise with the education. So we're not showing you generic boats out on the water and trying to teach you something. We're able to use an animated video to teach the very specific topic or subject that we want you to learn about. All of our courses also have an audio component that are professionally produced. It's not me talking. It's a professional voiceover guy. It's not an AI solution. It's something we've done for years. This video you can download. You can listen when you're on your way to work. You can listen when you don't have access to the internet. Or the way that I like to learn is there is a written lecture when I'm online. I like reading the lecture and listening to the audio. And that allows me to take notes, listen to somebody else saying the stuff that I'm absorbing. So that's how I like to learn. But with all these tools, you can pick and choose how you want to learn. And again, you've got 24/7 access to the program itself. Once you begin the course, you have a year to complete it. We have online instructors who are available where you can type in your questions, or if it's a more complex question, we also have instructors that you can speak live to. And that's all part of our program. In addition to the course itself, we also offer 24/7 technical support. So with an online program, if there's any reason you're having a problem connecting, or you can't download something, you can't upload something, or you're taking an online exam, whatever, we offer a service that's part of the program for 24/7. So it doesn't matter to us that these people are available, whether it's a holiday, whether it's a weekend, whether it's the middle of the day. So that's the written requirement piece to this. With the written requirements, the Coast Guard requires that you pass this proctored exam. Now, the way that we do this is, although it's considered to be one exam, it's broken into 4 parts, or what we call modules. The first module that you would take is chart plotting. There are 10 questions, and the Coast Guard requires that you get a 90% to pass. And again, and actually, so everyone always worries about chart plotting. If you know nothing about chart plotting, in many cases, it's easier for us to teach somebody who knows nothing about traditional chart plotting using what are called dividers and parallel rules and a real chart. The less you know, the easier it is for us, because we don't have to break you of bad habits. So everyone always worries about the chart plotting section. Not a big deal. You follow our processes. Within our course, we have, we'll teach you the information. Then we have what we call a quiz, which will make sure that you are up on a particular topic that we're teaching. And then at the end, when you get done with that lecture, there's a module exam to make sure that you have an overview of everything before you test. Then you've got navigation general, which is like not chart plotting. It's aids to navigation, buoys, things along those lines. So there are 50 questions. You need to get a 70 to pass that. Deck general, deck safety. That's kind of like weather, seamanship, marlin, spike, topics like that. Boat operations. Again, that's 50 questions. You need to get a 70 to pass this. And then finally, you'll finish up with rules of road. There's 50 questions. You need a 90% to pass. Now, the rules of road are very, very black and white. For me, it's one of the easiest sections because it's not open for interpretation. The rules are very, very specific. And if you use all the tools that are included within the program, you should be more than well prepared to pass. And then finally, we have an OUPV upgrade to Masters, which has 70 questions. So with this, the way our Masters is broken out, there's 2 parts. A part A has all the requirements for what the Coast Guard considers to be the 6-pack. And then there's a part B, which is the OUPV upgrade to Masters, which is 70 questions. When taken together, it will get you 1 license. And that's how we choose to teach this stuff. We also, with our online testing, it's 24/7. You do not have to have a previous appointment. You have access to that 24/7 technical support. And all the online testing is, again, at your own time on your own schedule. Once you've got your CPR, first aid, drug test, and physical, and you've passed the test, we'll provide you with a certificate of completion. You submit that to the Coast Guard in an application package with the other documents that we were talking about to the National Maritime Center. Now, in the old days, you used to have to mail it. In today's world, they want you to take your hard copy documents, scan them in, and turn them into a PDF file and email that to them. Email is great because once you do this, you will get a record saying that they had received it and with a number, so that any future communications, you would use this identification and this information that they gave you so they know who you are, and it gives you a written record that this has actually occurred. In today's world, the Coast Guard's taking 4 to 6 weeks to turn around a license where the paperwork is clean, accurate, complete, and not missing any information. It could be a little bit quicker, but expect it to be a 4 to 6 week turnaround time. Now, this also varies depending upon the National Maritime Center's workload. Sometimes a year they're a little less busy, other times they're a little bit more busy. So you can expect a 4 to 6 week turnaround time. Just because you submitted your application does not mean that you're a licensed captain. You cannot use the license itself. You cannot present yourself as a licensed captain. You cannot run charters or any of those other things prior to having the license in hand. The application fee with the Coast Guard is going to be $145. You're going to do that through pay.gov. And when you do make this payment, you're going to be able to print out a receipt. Make sure that you save that. Do not toss it. Any questions that you might have, Sammy?
Can boating experience be claimed in other countries?
So the question is, if I've got boating experience in other countries, may I use that towards my U.S. captain's license? The answer is yes. So the majority of my time was sailing around the world. I'd say probably 75% of my time that I used for my license was recorded overseas in Europe and all around the world. So for the boating experience piece, for that requirement, it does not need to be done within the United States or its boundaries.
Somebody was in the Navy, can military time count?
Sure. So now the question is, I was in the Navy, can military time count towards my captain's license? So that's a great question. I also am former military, and I also spent time in the Navy. I spent time on an aircraft carrier. And although I was out on the aircraft carrier a whole bunch, I was fixing jets and I was an electronic technician. Although I spent the time out on the water, I spent a lot of time underway because of the job and the duties that I performed on board that boat. None of my time would count towards getting my license. Now, if I had been a boatsman's mate or a yeoman or somebody who was part of ship's company that might have been serving navigational watches, that time would have been counted. So military time can be counted, but you can't be a cook. You can't be a medic. You need to be involved in the physical operation of that vessel. And then one more piece to this that's an important element is even if you meet all those requirements, only 60% of your time will be counted. So even if I was in the Coast Guard and I spent 100 days out on a Coast Guard cutter and I was a boatswain's mate and I was actively involved in every single minute that boat was underway, if I was out there for 100 days, the Coast Guard would only accept 60 towards my captain's license. So when it comes down to military people, if you can get there on your own without qualifying using your military sea service time, it's easiest just to use your own personal boat. You're not going to get additional bonus time, or you're not going to get additional consideration from the Coast Guard when they're issuing the credentials because it was on a military vessel versus your personal vessel. The same thing when we're talking about the sea service form. If you own your own boat, you can sign off your own time. If it was on friends or family's boats, they can sign that time off for you. Now, if you were out on my boat as a licensed master, I can sign that time off for you. But me being a licensed captain and you having a certified licensed master signing off your time, that's no more valuable in the Coast Guard's eyes for this requirement than you signing off your own time. So if you need to use the military time and you can meet the requirements in that you were physically involved in the operation of that vessel when it was underway, the Coast Guard will give you 60% of that time. They will not accept your DD-214 alone as proof of service. So you will need to request your military transcripts and submit that with your application as well. On our website, underneath our help desk, if you need this information, we have that form to request from the military, depending on which military branch you might be from. But again, if you can get to the minimum time on the water without using your military time, that would be my strongest recommendation. Anything else?
Last question for right now is, if they have 6 hours over a week, can they add it together?
Yeah, so the question is, I was out on the water in a 5-day period of time, and I had 6 hours. Can that count as a day? It cannot. So 4 hours needs to count as a day, and it needs to be done within one 24-hour period of time. So so we have people who race sailboats. We have people I've actually had people who were able to claim a good 20% of their time on a jet ski. The problem with like a jet ski is that, again, you need that 4 hours. There's not many people who go out on a jet ski and ride 4 hours continuously. If you do use experience on a jet ski or perhaps a sailboat that does not have an auxiliary sail, doesn't have an engine of at least 5 or 10 horsepower on it, 20% of that time can be counted towards the sea service time. That's it. So let's see. So let's talk about leveling up a little bit and some other opportunities that are there. So with a master's level license, there's a couple endorsements that you can qualify for. So the first one that we're going to discuss is called a towing endorsement. The towing endorsement can be issued to both those who have a 6-pack and also a master's license, and they would like to engage in assistance towing for a fee. So this is for a vessel that is aground, disabled, they may be out of fuel, or they have some sort of other malfunction that requires additional assistance. This is not a tugboat. You're not moving barges. You're not pushing large ships. That's not what this is. It's called an assistance towing endorsement. And it is basically kind of like the AAA of the waterways. So if you think Towboat US or Boat US, those captains who are running those boats, on their license, they have a towing endorsement. The towing endorsement is relatively simple. It's a 4 or 5 hour online program. When you complete the course, we'll give you that certificate of completion, and you would submit that with your main application if it's your original license, and they will put that on your license. If you already have a license and you'd like to upgrade your license, well, then you can go down that path as well. So again, a towing endorsement, it can be put on either a 6-pack or a master's. It allows you to help people who are disabled, the AAA of the waters, as I said, Boat US or Towboat US, but it is not something that allows you to be a tugboat operator or pushing or moving large barges. Is that something completely separate and outside the scope of anything that we're discussing today? So that's the first endorsement that you can have on your license. The second endorsement is called a sailing endorsement. And what a sailing endorsement allows you to do is, if you're going to be taking 7 or more passengers out on an inspected passenger vessel and it is a sailboat, then you will be required to have a sailing endorsement. So the Coast Guard is managing risk. So when we were talking about the 6-pack is good for both power and sail. When it comes down to the master's level license, if you are running an inspected sailing vessel and it's going to have more than 6 paying passengers on board, then you're going to need to get this sailing endorsement. Now, myself, as I said, I'm a licensed master. I have both a sailing and a towing endorsement on my license. I've never once used the license that I carry. I've never once used it at a master's level. I've never once used my sailing endorsement, nor have I ever used my towing endorsement. However, collectively, all of those on my resume and on my license has served me very, very well. So going back to what we said earlier, we always recommend that you get the highest level license that you can qualify for. The towing endorsement does not have any additional time requirements. The sailing endorsement is going to require 50% of your time to be done on a sailboat. So if you are a power boater and and you don't have a minimum of 180 days on a sailboat, you're not going to qualify for a sailing endorsement, even if you take the course. So again, the sailing endorsements for people who are on vessels, sailing vessels that have a COI, a certificate of inspection, that are approved for more than 6 paying passengers. And then finally, with regards to leveling up, if you do get a 6-pack, or if you currently have a 6-pack and you would like to upgrade to a master's level license, you're not locked in at the 6-pack level. We do have a program that's approved by the Coast Guard that will take somebody who has a 6-pack and upgrade them to a master's level license. You're going to have to meet the time requirements and all the other requirements that we discussed, but this program will take you to the next step and meet the educational requirements the Coast Guard has for that level license. Any other questions?
Not about those 3.
So let's just talk briefly about some of the career opportunities that might come your way. So we talk about charter services. You can host recreational or sport fishing trips. A lot of people with their master's level license, they're running, especially when we're talking about fishing, they're generally on head boats, boats that are taking more than 6 paying passengers out for hire. Sports fishing boats, again, if you were to go out on an overnight tuna trip, many of those types of trips have more than 6 paying passengers on board that boat. Just because the economics of running one of those trips, those captains all have master's level licenses. You can do the sailing tours for tourists and enthusiasts. So if you go into like Newport or any of the popular ports on the east and west coast, sometimes when you're in these towns, you'll see a little kiosk set up outside of a marina or outside on a main walking path where somebody's selling tickets to go out on their boat. So most of those sailing tours or most of those harbor tours are going to take more than 6 paying passengers. So again, that's an opportunity for you to have a master's level license. One of the things that I like about having my master's level license is I get to operate on my schedule. So for me, it is just a side business that supplements some of my income in addition to running a school and other operations that I have going on. And then the other thing that it can really help with is build a local trust with the businesses on the water. Letting them know. So I work with hotels and I'll find the concierge. And a lot of times if I fly into an area and I have my family with me, I may want to take them on a special trip. I might want to do something outside the norm. So I always try to find the concierge in some of the top hotels in the areas in which I operate and let them know that I'm running charters. I'm a licensed master. And this is the boat that I have. And for them recommending people, there is always a little bit of cash that I give them back because I wouldn't have found these people without their assistance. So those are some areas for charter services. Teaching. Obviously, I do a lot of teaching. I teach, not only do we teach in a classroom and online and this methodology, but for years, I used to teach, I had 4-day live aboard courses on my boat. So basically, we would have 3 couples would come on my boat and we would spend 3 days and go from, I'm in New Jersey, so we would go from our Barnegat Bay to Atlantic City. We'd stay overnight. They'd go play in the casinos and things like that. We'd stay in a marina. Then we would go south and we would stop in Cape May. And there's a really great place to get lobster in Cape May and some other nights entertainment places. And then we would go up to Chesapeake and we'd stay someplace out on the water overnight throughout the anchor. And we would do some nighttime navigation and things like that. And then the next day we would either end up in Annapolis or Baltimore, depending on the trip. And then my office would bring down 3 more couples with food and provisions and take the other 3 couples back to where they originated. And then I would bring the boat back. I was doing $60,000 or $70,000 a summer doing that stuff. And it was really easy for us to fill up the boat. And what was happening was we were taking people who would never have gone out at nighttime, that would never been in the ocean, and we were teaching them the skills. Now, their experience when they got done, they thought that they ran the boat. I may not have been touching the wheel, and I may not have been specifically steering, but there wasn't a whole lot that they were doing that I wasn't part of. But it gave them, there was great confidence boosters, and it was a really nice way of sharing my love for the water. You can work with sailing schools, camps, private clients. Working with sailing schools, again, having a master's level license. 2 people want the same sailing job, teaching at a school. My experience has always been the guy or gal who's got the master's level license is one up over the person who's got a 6-pack. You can use your license for teaching. Again, myself, I got my license. I never thought I was going to be running a school. But when I did decide that I was going to run a licensing school, I already had the credentials that I needed. I was able to convert those. And truthfully, if I didn't, I don't know that we'd be having this conversation right now. And I find an obligation to make a difference and educate the next generation, making sure I spend time with kids. I want to make sure, in fact, we just had a call with a school that's what they do is they teach kids. And we're going to be doing some work with them to make sure that the youngsters that are out there are getting a really good, solid education so that they can build upon that as they grow. And then we talk about leading some unforgettable experiences, taking people out on eco tours, wildlife spotting, our island hops, really great situations with where we are. There's a lot of eco tours, and there's birds, there's dolphins, there's whales, so whale watching tours, looking for wildlife. There's nothing quite like it when you see a kid find a dolphin for the first time, or see a whale for the first time, or see a sea turtle, or any of the other things. Those are really, really great things. I also talk a little bit about island hopping, which is pretty cool. You can go to beaches and maybe sandbars and things like that, which are pretty cool. But the other thing that I also did, which worked out very well, was I also found the local realtors in my area, because I'm in a waterfront area, or I was at the time. And I found realtors who were selling waterfront home, and I made deals with them that I would take their clients to the properties that they wanted to see by boat. So if I'm showing off properties, I can drive, or if I show up and give them that experience, this could be your dock. This could be you bringing your friends to your location. It was a really great way, and the realtors couldn't be happier. And some of the areas that I was operating in the summertime, especially, the visitor traffic was very, very high. So for me to get to 3 or 4 different properties by car might have taken an hour or 2, but by boat, we were able to get there in 15 or 20 minutes. We were able to make it a really great experience. We went one to the next, and they were able to look at all the neighbors, and it was just a great experience. So just another way of earning some money. Personalized boating experiences, new people to the area. Some people just want to take their friends or family out on something special, something that they wouldn't normally do. Great way of doing this. One of the things that always worked well for me was I had local expertise. So local knowledge goes a long way. I could tell them stories about different properties that were going by, different people who owned it. I spent a little bit of time in Miami and was doing some stuff down there. And you could just take them out and say, well, this rich guy lives here, and this person lives there, and this person's over here, and this is where this went down, and this went down. And I always did it in a very professional manner. And it worked. So one of the problems that I see with a lot of captains is they don't do what they say when they say they're going to do it. And that's a problem. So if I told you I was going to be someplace, you could count on me being there. In fact, I was probably going to be there half an hour before I said I was going to be. Otherwise, I was already late in my world. I was always very, very professional. Now, in my world, I don't really like, I don't wear captain's bars, a hat, or any of those other things. Plenty of people do, and that's cool. No problem. It's just not my thing. But I greet them very professionally. I'm dressed very well. I'm always very cautious with what I say and how I say things. If I'm running somebody else's boat for them for that evening, I don't treat them any differently than I would a friend. And I don't expect them to treat me any differently than they would a friend. I'm not a big fan of being a subservient type of a person, but as long as you treat everybody with a professional attitude, they generally give that back to you. And then it was very easy for me to build a loyal client base. In fact, my first 8 or 10 years of business with my license, I never once put an ad out in the newspaper. I never once listed myself on the internet. In fact, I got to the point where I had to turn people down because there was only so many days in a week, and there was only so much time for me to be able to run these charters. So, and word of mouth was really a key element to our success. Some other opportunities, just turning your passion into profession, is running a water taxi or harbor boat tours or whale watching tours. So those top three, you need to be a little bit more personable, because being a licensed captain is one element. But when you're running water taxis, if you have stories of where you are, and if you're polite and you can make recommendations on where somebody might want to go for dinner, or where a good bar is, or where there's a good museum, or whatever's in that area. When you're running water taxis, harbor boat tours, and even like the whale watching tours, when you do whale watching tours or dolphin trips, once you've seen one dolphin, you've seen a bunch of them. And if you do it every day, it's great when you find them, because that's what you're there for, but it's not as exciting for you. You have to have the ability of sharing with those clients the excitement that they now have, because that might be the first whale that they've ever seen, and you need to make it look like it was the first whale that you ever saw. So, and that's tricky, because not everybody, some people just want to drive the boat. Well, if you just want to drive the boat, being a water taxi driver or harbor boat tour or whale watching tours, that might not be the best piece for you. Perhaps you might just want to run a ferry boat. Dive boats, again, having those interpersonal skills is pretty important. And then the sailing schooners. And for you sailors out there, the one thing I'll tell you is just a quick story on this. As I said, I've got my master's license with both the sailing and towing endorsement. I'm in New Jersey. A number of years ago, I was contacted by two big ship companies that wanted to pay me a lot of money to be on board their boats when they were cruising around New York and the city. And they were all inspected passenger vessels, and they all met the requirements. And they needed a licensed captain on board, and they needed somebody who carried the level license that I have. The trick of this was their crews were all European. I wasn't actually in charge of the boat, and all I was basically a greeter who's going to walk around as a licensed captain, meet their legal requirements. I would most strongly recommend against doing something like that, because if that boat hit somebody or ran aground or somebody got hurt, I was a licensed captain who was in charge of that boat. So when it comes down to the sailing schooners, if you do have that opportunity, which is a very exciting, very cool opportunity, just make sure you know whether you're running that boat or somebody else might be running that boat. Any questions or things I can help with now?
Somebody wants to know, how often do you need to renew?
So great question. So the question is, how often do I need to renew my license? The license is good for 5 years. So every 5 years, I need to renew my license. The requirements, if I have 360 days within those 5 years, it's basically just paperwork. I will have to do another physical. I will need to either be in a random drug testing program or take another drug test. I will not need to do the CPR and First Aid card, nor will I have to do the TWIC card. So the license is good for 5 years. Now, they don't mean 5 years in a day. So if your license expires, it's really expired. Now, the Coast Guard has loosened up. They used to give you a 1-year grace period where you couldn't use the license, but you didn't lose it. Since COVID, they've opened that up a little bit. They've changed those regulations. I'm not going to quote the days that they have now because in 5 years from now, it probably won't be the same. But the license is good for 5 years. Anything else?
Not this one.
That's what we got. So we're at the end of this. Anyone who's got any questions, there's lots of ways of contacting us. You can contact us through the Mariners Learning System website. We also have a definitive guide to getting your captain's license. There's a QR code up there where you can just scan that. You can reach us via phone at 609-303-0664. We've got email support. We also have a chat room. We manage our chat from 9 a.m. till 10, is it?
Yes.
So we have a chat room where we have live people who are managing it from 9 a.m. to 10 p.m. Eastern time. After that, we have an AI chatbot that's really good. We spend a lot of time and money and investment in making sure that it can answer most questions that you have. And if you still need a human or human support, you can indicate that to the after-hour chatbot, and it will grab your information and make sure that one of our support reps reaches out to you the next day. Or you can also submit a ticket through our help center. Lots of ways of contacting us. In an hour or two after you get done, after this is over, we'll send out a link so that you have access to the information that I've just provided. And then anyone who's on this, we were running the sale over the weekend for the holiday. I'm going to extend this for anyone who's on board or who stuck around this long. If you are not a student and would like to purchase the program, you can enroll for the master's level license and take 30% off the 6-pack. The masters are the upgrade course. We're going to allow this sale through Sunday. Today is Thursday night, so we'll allow it to go through Sunday. Any other questions or anything else I can help anybody with?
No, that's it with the questions.
I think that's what we've got for this particular webinar. I want to thank you for your attention and giving us the opportunity of providing that information for you. If there's any additional questions, don't ever hesitate to pick up the phone. True enough, I'd love you to purchase our program. Make no mistake about that. However, our goal is always just to provide good, honest, knowledgeable information, and you make the decision that's best for you. If we happen to win, great. If we don't, well, that's okay too. So again, have a safe night, and we do appreciate the opportunity. Be well.